relationship series now for the last several weeks, and today's no exception. I'm just as excited today about what God has given to me to share with you, and I trust it'll be a real help to you in your relationships, and that has to do with all of our relationships. If we make proper application of God's Word, it will affect every relationship we have, and so that's really important, and we want you to know that. Now, I know that growing up in relationships, one of the things that has been probably one of the most difficult parts about relationships is learning how to take a back seat and let somebody else take the lead. In relationships, that's very difficult because most of us have a particular way that we think, and we go a certain direction with our thoughts and with our actions, and the reason we do is because we believe in what we think, right? And so therefore, if somebody thinks different than us, then they have to be wrong, because otherwise, if they're not wrong, then we have to be wrong, and sometimes that's hard to admit. True? Okay, it's just me. There's a couple of you that are willing. All right. That's sometimes a difficult part about relationships. Otherwise, you believe in nothing, and you just kind of float along in life, and you let everybody else think for you, and it just doesn't matter. But if you are a thinker and you kind of figure some stuff out, then when other people don't agree with the way you figured it out, then there comes this impasse, and you gotta come to a place where you gotta say, hey, is it me or is it them, or what's the deal, right? Every one of us got to deal with that all the time. And for those of you that are single in the building, let me just say, I know what you think in your mind is, boy, I can't wait until I get married, or, unfortunately, we live in a world today that marriage doesn't seem to be all that important, and you may be one to think, well, when I find that person to live with, which is not the biblical way to go about it. God wants you to be married. I'm just going to put that out there, all right? But you get this concept in your mind that all things are going to be rainbows and unicorns and fairy tales and all that kind of thing. When you find that right person, everything's going to turn right. No, it turns more challenging. I'm just saying there's more things you have to deal with in relationships, and getting married, finding that right person in your life is no exception. As for any relationship you have, it comes with challenges. And so for those that are married, men, I know that, some of the things that we deal with is that, well, first of all, let me just say this. Ladies, you're confusing. All right, I just want to put that out there. I'm just going to say you're confusing, all right? And that's just from my perspective as a man, okay? Now, you may not see it that way, and that's perfectly fine. You may find no confusion at all. But I believe you do if you're really honest, because there's nothing like, and let me give you an example. Ladies, how confusing you are is that all of a sudden, and it's like, what's wrong? I don't know. You don't even know, all right? So you know what I'm saying. It gets confused. I've never come up on a dude who was, and I say, what's wrong? You just don't find that. I don't know, unless they're a worship leader. But, I love the word. Anyway, the thing is that, and I'm kidding, but here's the thing, is that we find that in relationships, when we connect, just become more, life becomes a little more complicated, which isn't a bad thing. Complicated things are not bad. When we were young, we liked simple things. As we get older, we find more complicated things. Our toys become more complicated, right? Our relationships become more complicated. Everything becomes more complicated as we get older, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. All right? It's just more challenging. And so you find that your relationships with one another, men and women, become more challenging when you get married, because you find out that this person who there was nothing they could do wrong, all of a sudden it's the little things that will irritate the snot out of you, right? And you find yourself in that place. I recall when my wife had taken my car. I had bought a brand new car, uh, one and only brand new car I'd ever bought. When I was young, I guess I was probably 22, 23 when I bought the car. And so after I got married, my wife used a car and had gone down to, it was a jet black Tempo, Ford Tempo. It was a nice little car, sporty car, uh, 5 speed, and enjoyed that. And I remember she went to the drive-through one day, and I remember that she got some food, and she came home and she said, um, "I scratched the car a little bit," and I'm like, "Okay." Um, inside, I'm like, "Are you okay?" But inside, I'm wanting to say, "Is the car okay?" But inside, "Are you okay?" Yes. And so I said, "Well, I'll go out and check it out." And so I went out, and she had nagged a yellow post, so my car looked like a bumblebee now. It had these yellow stripes down the side of it, right underneath the rearview mirror, and it had caught the rearview mirror and bent it up like this. And so I was rather sick to my stomach, as I looked at the car, and I thought, "Oh man," and those things happen, right? Life becomes a little more complicated, and the frustrations there, and the anxiety level rises, and then God reminds me of just several months prior to that. I was topping over a hill one day, probably driving just a weensy bit faster than I should have been, and there happened to be a car parked in the road at the foot of the hill, and another car parked in the road in the foot of the hill, side by side, taking both lanes, and there's nowhere to go. And when your wheels are up off the ground from hitting a hill a little bit faster, okay, in Kentucky on no country road, all I could do is hit the brake midair, knowing that as soon as the car hit the ground again, I was going to be into a power slide, right? And so I lodged the car into a ditch. Thank God I didn't hit anybody. I went over, rode the ditch, lodged the car in the ditch. The back wheels were still off the ground when it came to a complete stop. And got out of the car. But here's the deal, is that God reminded me that this little scratch or nick on the side of the car is I did more damage to the car before she did that to the car. We got it fixed, but listen, and we all make mistakes, but sometimes we see other people's mistakes a whole lot quicker, and we become a lot more irritated with other people's mistakes than we take recognition for our own. And in relationships, that can suck the life out of your relationships. That can cause damage to your relationships. And I want to share with you this morning something I think is crucially important for us to understand. And again, I'm going to go back to Hebrews chapter 6 that I had shared on Sunday night, and just a few verses there, and then I'm going to be kicking into our passage for today. But in Hebrews chapter 6, the scripture says in verse number 18 and following, "So that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled to refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain, where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." Now, you might look at me and go, "I didn't understand any of that." Simply put, what this is talking about is that Jesus has become the high priest on our behalf, and he has entered into the holy place of God on our behalf, and he is our anchor on our behalf, our anchor of hope. Now, this is what's really important about this anchor of hope, is realizing that Jesus is our anchor. And I shared with you Sunday night that a lot of people want a helicopter Jesus, or they want an airplane Jesus. They want a Jesus that's going to sweep in, pick them up, take them out of their problem, and carry them to another place. But understand what an anchor is all about. An anchor is about setting you steady and faithful in the middle of a storm, not taking you out of it, but giving you hope in the middle of a storm. An anchor is at its best use when it has plundered to the bottom of the ocean and it has lodged itself at the bottom of the ocean, and it has lodged itself in a way that sets you secure. Understand that Jesus is our anchor. That's powerful. That's important for you not to miss that. Now, here's the thing. As we thought about that on Sunday night, I was using that in relation to helping everyone to understand that God has called us to send out missionaries around the world in order that men and women could understand that Jesus wants to have a relationship with them, not so that he can pull them out of all their troubles, but that he can be the anchor in the middle of their storms. You may have come to a point in a time in your life where you were going to church years ago, and it felt like no matter how hard you tried to do the right thing, and the more you got involved in church, the more you did, that the worse life got and the harder it got, and you kind of come to a point where you got fed up with it up to here, and you were looking for a helicopter Jesus, and he wasn't coming to your rescue to pull you out. I want you to have a proper view of who Jesus is. Jesus is an anchor. I mean, honestly, I would rather a helicopter Jesus, right? Humanly, all of us would rather a helicopter Jesus, but he's not a helicopter Jesus. He is an anchor. An anchor is something. You say, well, here's the deal. I just don't see Jesus in the midst of my problems and my trials and my difficulties. Listen, if you see the anchor, there's a problem. An anchor's not meant to be seen, it's meant to work. And if you can see the anchor, that means the anchor's not down lodged in the bottom, giving you the stability you need. Jesus is an anchor in the midst of our storm, our problems, our relationships, the things that we have to deal with. He is the anchor. And we need to understand that is our hope as believers, but that's also the hope the whole world needs to understand is who Jesus is. That's why we send missionaries around the world to share the anchor of the soul. Because our soul needs an anchor. And that anchor is Jesus. So as we've been studying on relationships, I want to take you back to Genesis chapter 3. And we're going to drill just a little bit deeper on a subject that we hit on a few weeks back. And so if you would, turn to Genesis chapter 3, beginning in verse number 11. And I'm going to do some reading from there. We'll have it on the screen for those that don't have your Bible with you. But if you do, I would ask for you to pull that out and use that. In Genesis chapter 3, in verse number 11, listen to what God's word says. And he said, who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten of the tree of which I commanded you not to eat? By the way, I think probably as soon as we read that, for anybody that has any kind of church history or background, you know that this is talking about Adam and Eve in the garden. If you don't have any church history, that's okay. Let me help you understand. This is about our forefather and mother, the first man, first woman that God created in the garden. When God created the heavens and the earth, and God had made a garden with all these trees in the garden, and God said, you can eat of every tree in the garden except for the tree in the middle of the garden. You're not to eat of that tree. The day that you eat of that tree, you will surely die. And so what we find here in this passage, and this is what I don't want you to miss, is we understand that God asked a question, have you eaten of the tree of which, what are those next three words? Of which I commanded you. Now, I want you to hear this for a minute. When God gives a command, what does that mean that he is doing? He's giving us what? Huh? All right? Or instruction, or direction. God's giving us what he wants us to know, and therefore when God speaks, those are his commands or his word, right? It's his speech, his word. Now please don't miss this. God instructs us how we're to live our life. He instructs us to what life is to look like. He instructs us to how we are to approach him. He instructs us to what our attitude about him needs to be through his word. And here's what he's saying. Have you, and I'm going to paraphrase this for just a moment, okay, because here's what's being said. Have you not obeyed my commandment? Have you not obeyed my word? Did you not do what I told you to do? Does that make sense? Parents, has your children ever done something they shouldn't do, and the comment that came out of your mouth when you saw them and you set them down and they got like it all smeared all over their face and all over the wall and all over everything, that you looked and you said, did I not tell you? Have you ever said those words to your children before? Did I not say? You never had to say that, have you? Well, you're blessed, because it wasn't that way in my home. Those were the comments I had. Did your mom not tell you? What did your mother say? What did your father tell you to do? Why are we having this conversation? Are you with me? You tracking with me? Those that are parents, you know what I'm talking about. Those that are not parents, you've heard those words said, no doubt. Right? And here's the deal. Here's the deal. God had commanded, God had instructed, God had told Adam and Eve what he had expected from them. And when they did not do what God wanted, when they did not listen to his words, that in and of itself, listen to me, is sin. I remember when I was a kid, my dad was going to teach me how to swim. You don't want my dad teaching you how to swim. I'm just saying, okay? So he said, he got me and he put me out in the water and he told me, he said, son, I'm going to teach you how to swim. I said, oh, that's great, Dad. He said, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to turn you on your belly. I'm going to hold you up. And what you do is you kick your arms and your legs and get them going and stuff. And I said, okay, Dad, just don't let go of me. Oh, you just got to trust me, son. Dad, I don't want to drown. You just got to trust me, son. I won't let you drown. I thought he was going to let me drown when he took his arms out of underneath of me and I sunk like a rock. But I was kicking with everything I had. And I was not floating, all right? And I remember he grabbed me and pulled me up out of the water as I went, all right? And all that water going in my lungs, and I thought, I'll never let you do that again, all right? That's back in the days. It was sink or swim, right? I learned with my kids not to do that with my kids, but to teach them a little bit more of the principle and actually give them an instructor, teach them how to swim, other than myself, all right? Because I probably would teach them the same way my dad did. So we took our kids down to the Lloyd pool and let them take classes, because I think learning to swim is an important thing to know. And so here's the deal. I had to exercise trust with my dad. I remember as a kid, not as a kid, but when my kids were little, I would say to my kids, hey, I want you to jump off that ledge and I'll catch you. You ever do that with your kids? All right, just jump. They stand there and they're going, just jump. I don't know. Just trust me. I'll catch you. Jump. Now, that was a difficult process. I understand that process because when we've gone to camp with the teens out at Camp Reveal, they have what's known as a pamper pole, and it's everything but pamper, all right? And what you would do is you put on this harness around your body, and they would belay you on this side and belay you on this side with, and belay is not fillet, okay, but belay with a couple ropes on on your harness, and they go way up onto some telephone poles and around some pulleys and back down, and you got people on each end of that rope, and they're your belayers. They're the people, if you were to fall, they got you. Okay? And so what they would have you do is to climb up this telephone pole, and the telephone pole was on a hill, and they wanted you to face out, and of course the pole was about, I'm going to say 20 feet high maybe or so, which is pretty high for a telephone pole, 20, 25 feet high. And then when you get on top of it and the hill's going down like that, you feel like you're about 50 feet high. And so you climb up the telephone pole, and by the way, the pole's about that big around, and they got these spikes outside of it, so it's easy climbing till you get to the top. And now you get to the top, and you got to figure out how to get your whole body up on top and stand on top of the pole. That was the hard part, all right? But once you got up there, the point was, this is called the pamper pole, and it's called trusting your belayers. And they would say, now, when you're ready, jump. Trust your belayers. And you're standing up there and your heart's beating out of your chest. You think, but what if I said something to that person earlier today and they're mad at me? What if they, just one of them, decide not to belay and they let go of the rope? I'm going to go, and one person hold me, I'm going to do zoom, boom, right over into that telephone pole over there. So if they're not both doing their job, you're in trouble. Well, being the trusting kind of person I am, I'm like, okay, here we go. And I jumped backwards and I spun around. I didn't care. It was fun. But I watched some of the teens get up there, and they would just stand and they would freeze. And they would be up there almost 3-5 minutes, and then their knees would start knocking. And it's like, you know what? You're killing yourself. Just jump. I mean, you're torturing yourself to just trust the belayers. Jump. How many of you think you could do that? Not even half of you, okay? But there are ones that would. That's awesome. Now, let me just put it this way. We find ourselves, when it comes to the point, listen, don't miss this. When God commands us to do something, you know what He's saying to us? He's saying, trust me. When God is asking for you to be submitted and surrendered to Him, He is saying to you, trust me. And when God said to Adam and Eve, don't eat of that tree, because the day you eat of that tree, you'll die. Trust me. I've got your best in mind. And so what we find in Genesis, and we're going to look at that in Genesis, He says, have you eaten of the tree that I commanded you not to eat? And in verse 12 it says, the man said, the woman whom you gave to me, or gave to be with me, she gave me fruit of the tree, and I ate. What did Adam do? He threw Eve under the bus. Now listen to what happens here, and this is the whole point. I'm not going to belabor the point. I'm not going to go through and read a lot of the other verses, because we did that the other day, and you can go back and read them yourself. But here's the deal, is that when we find ourselves in a place where we are not willing to submit and to surrender and to trust God with what He says, listen to what I'm telling you, that's when our relationships suffer the worst. You want to understand why Adam threw Eve under the bus? Let me just put it this way. Adam threw Eve under the bus for this reason. Because when we are not properly surrendered to God, when we are not trusting, depending on what God says, and by the way, to trust in God is more than just a head knowledge. It is a surrendering of our own will. And listen, I've had some people say to me, yeah, I'll trust God as long as. That's not trust. You're still in charge. You're still in control. As long as you're in control, then you're not trusting God. Trusting God is saying, God, I'm trusting you. I'm giving it to you. I'm not relying on my own way of thinking. Matter of fact, what does the Bible say in Proverbs 3, 5, and 6? Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not to your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge Him, and He'll direct your path. It's when I'm not trusting God, then I'm depending on myself. Remember what I said the other day? I know I said this on Sunday night. I I can't remember if I said this on Sunday morning, but I'll say it now. When other things become an option in our life, then we begin to doubt where things are right now for us. When we start allowing other things to become options in our life, we have no confidence in what we have right here, right now. In other words, men and women who begin to allow other people to be a part of their dependency, and they start seeing other people as options, then you become dissatisfied with the one you're with. In your relationship in your church, when anything else begins to become an option to you, you become dissatisfied with your church. When anything becomes another option to you in your relationships and friendships, then the relationships and friendships you have now will suffer because of it, when we allow other things to be an option. And here's what happened. Adam and Eve allowed other options to come into play, and now they became dissatisfied with what God had commanded them to do. They began to doubt God. Their confidence began to erode. And I want you to know that when we are not properly surrendered and submitted to God, then we will never be properly surrendered to our relationships that we have on this earth. We will always be more likely to shift blame on others for our failure when we're not being submitted and surrendered to God. Well, Pastor, how in the world can you say that? Well, let me just say it this way. When you truly trust God in your life, there's nothing that's going to happen in your life that's going to shake your tree, because I'm trusting God. God laid that step. He had that to happen that way, and I'm trusting Him. I'm not going to let that bother me, because God's in control of my life, and I'm not going. Pamper Pole City, let's go. Let's just jump. Come on. God is saying, trust me. And we're saying, well, God, I'll trust you as long as you do this, as long as I see this happen. And now it's really not that you're trusting God. You're trusting your plan that you want God to become a part of. And that's not trusting God. Our trusting God is the most. Here's why that's important, because you know what sin is? Sin is not being submitted and surrendered to God. It's when we're not trusting God. What does the Bible say? Submit to God, resist the devil, and the devil will flee from you. What's that about? It's about submitting to Him, trusting Him with all our heart. And when we're not trusting and submitting to God, listen, every relationship you have is going to suffer. It's going to suffer. So what is submission? Let me just put it in one word. You ready? Submission is simply this. To be submitted and surrendered to God is simply this. To trust God. That's it. Trust Him. Trust Him with your health. Trust Him with your family. Trust Him with your kids. Trust Him with your job. Trust Him with your bills. Trust Him with everything in your life. Oh, I trust God. I'm not talking about theoretically trusting God. I'm talking about practically trusting God. Yeah, I trust my wife. But when it comes down to it, if I were to talk to your wife and say, does your wife trust you? Well, most of the time she does. She doesn't always, but she does. Or vice versa. Say to the wife, does your husband trust you? Oh, yeah, on occasion. Most of the time, yes, he trusts me. But you know what? Here's what we have to understand. Our trust in God is our being removed or taken out of that concept of being in sin. God doesn't want us to live in sin. And sin is when we're in a place where we're not submitted and surrendered to God. Period. So what did you submit and surrender to God today? No, what did you mentally think about and talk to God about through prayer and say, God, I am submitting this to you today? Don't tell me you're submitted and surrendered to God when you're not taking time to submit and surrender things to God. And by the way, God doesn't work on a sweeping note, Oh, I did that when I got saved. That's just like a man or woman that came into counseling one day to Dad, and Dad was talking to him, and a woman said, my husband never tells me he loves me, and blah, 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 and she's going on, and he said, is that true? And he looked at Dad and he said, look, when we got married, I told her I love you, and if anything changed, I'd tell you. That don't work out real good, okay? And it's not a sweeping moment where we go, okay, yeah, I trust God. I've always trusted God. No, are you trusting God right now? Are you submitting to God right now? What have you submitted to God today? What have you put in His care that you're trusting Him with today? Have you done that? We have to find ourselves in that place where we're not just living a concept, we're living a reality. And the reality is, are we trusting God? Are we depending on Him? It's not easy. Yesterday, when the bus did what it did, it's a matter where it's immediately, God, submit this to you, surrender it to you. God, we don't know what the next step's going to look like. We don't know how this all going to play out. But at the end of the day, we know that you've got this under control. And we're submitting it to you. We had a great time. I don't know that there was one person that I'm aware of, at least I never encountered it, that had a bad attitude through the whole thing. Now, a little frustration here and there, that happens. I was frustrated. But no bad attitudes that I ran into with a group that was on the bus. Didn't see it. You know what? How much more anxiety-free are we going to live when we just trust God? How much more healthier are we going to be when we just trust God? How healthier will our relationships be when we just trust God? You may be here today and you may be in a situation where your relationship is really strained. Maybe there's been some complications that have happened in your relationship with different people. And I just want you to understand this. If you're truly trusting God, then you don't have to let it shake your tree. You don't have to be worried because God's in control of it all. All you need to do is say, God, I give it to you, and I ask you just to iron out the wrinkles and all this, and God, you help in your time to make this work as it's supposed to. And just trust God. It's not about what you can do or about what somebody else has or has not done to you. But it's trusting. Trust. Because He is the anchor to the soul. When we trust Him, just trust Him in the middle of our storms and our difficulties and our problems, in our ill health, whatever it might be, in our financial difficulties, whatever it might be. When we trust God, we live a much more peaceful, God-honoring life, and our relationships are sweeter